Hello. Thank you, Charles, Adriana, Pedro, Felipe, for the invitation. My role here is, first of all, to introduce Iñaki Echeverri, and second of all, it will be to try to engage in an interesting and fruitful conversation regarding landscape urbanism. Iñaki Echeverri is an architect, landscape urbanist, and entrepreneur based in Mexico City. His eponymous firm specializes in the integration of techniques conventionally associated to architecture, science, technology, and ecology to reconsider this intersection as an opportunity to transform buildings, landscape, and infrastructure. Echeverri is an academic in Harvard, UPenn, TU, Berlin, UNAM, Iberoamericana, and since 2008 founded an annual workshop at IED's Network Campus, Berlin. His work on the private and public realms has been widely published and exhibited in America, Africa, Asia, and Europe. Please join me to welcome Iñaki.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's great to participate in this conversation, especially after seeing the project from this morning. I'm even more excited. Because of time constraint, I will read to you. I apologize for this, but my English is not good enough to warrant a 20-minute presentation otherwise. Thank you, Alfredo, for the introduction, and I look forward to our conversation. Especially thank you, Charles, for the invitation to landscape urbanism in the Americas and to contribute to the Harvard Office for Urbanization efforts. I was asked, sorry, where is this? Is this one, right? I was asked by you, Charles, to speak about our Parque Texcoco project, but I will resist to do so. Not because I don't think it's relevant, even if it was done 8 years ago, but because it is no longer viable as it was conceived. Our project for Texcoco was first and foremost an infrastructure project, a stormwater management and risk control system that would become the cornerstone for a reclamation project for a balanced urban habitation of the Zona Metropolitana del Valle de Mexico. The construction of the new airport on part of the same land makes it almost impossible to attain this goal now. I prefer to speak today of some of the things we learned while working on this project and how it shaped my current practice and the work we engage. Throughout this investigation, I devised a design methodology for what I called a gardener's logic in an article I wrote over 15 years ago together with Richard Plunce, the director of the Urban Design Lab at the Earth Institute. While working on Texcoco, I became deeply interested in projects of a different kind to those I had engaged from a mostly architectural lineage perspective. In these other projects, scale, culture, art, design, and technology overlap, and the role of the designer and the meaning of design must be reconsidered and its objectives amplified. These projects go beyond the cultural lineage of our profession and may impact on many levels of reality. In these projects, we are motivated by large scale rather than large size. Paraphrasing a term that I learned in MIT and is now very a la mode in Silicon Valley, projects that we consider moonshots. A moonshot is shorthand for a difficult or expensive task, the outcome of which is expected to have great significance. They coined this term because of the trip to the moon. You know, to put a man on the moon was really senseless, but everything that came out of this endeavor is actually created the world that we live in today. So a good moonshot should have three key ingredients. First, it inspires. It raises the spirit. A more typical corporate goal of increasing return on invested capital might be important, but it is unlikely to get people to do really extraordinary things. Talking about projects like mapping the human brain. Second, it is credible. It is easy to assume that a moonshot is just a ridiculous stretched target, like artificial intelligence, which is still far, but it is no longer science fiction. This is IBM's Watson, which is kind of looking forward to bring artificial intelligence to the cloud and to democratize it or make it accessible through public access to the web. And finally, third element, it is imaginative. It isn't an obvious extrapolation of what's happening today, but something that offers a meaningful break from the past, like Norman Foster's 3D printed Mars habitat. So today I will talk about some quests in my office which are far, far, far less grandiose than a colony in Mars, but are more ambitious for us than just good or even great culturally relevant design. I will not present Texcoco because I hate talking about what things could have been. I much prefer to devote my time and energy to the potential for real positive transformation that abounds in the world today. Parque Texcoco was our first moonshot. Even if we didn't get there, by trying, we learned so much. We became aware of so many challenges and opportunities that exist in the world today that things in my practice were never back to the same. By 2050, about 95% of all people in the world will inhabit cities of some kind. 30 cities will become home to more than 20 million people. It is needless to say that what we do in the near future with our cities and the system that support them will pretty much define the quality of existence of all humankind. The study of the potential for transformation of cities, the introduction of specific strategies to affect the assumptions that threaten this model, and securing their future existence is crucial. Cities have proven to be our most effective creation to nurture empathy, tolerance, creativity, and innovation. The subsistence and improvement of cities may become the strongest contribution of designers to the future of all mankind. In my office, we have engaged some lines of investigations that we think may affect on a very large scale the future of cities. Investigations that we believe benefit from the study through a model that intersects scale, culture, design, art, science, and technology. My mind is now really half devoted to this endeavor I call Urban Studios. Even if the research it involves is not sponsored by any institution yet, we're testing a system to pursue this. I use my work with students to explore through a design-based logic, questions that relate to the Urban Studios research interests. After some iterations with different academic groups, these design-driven investigations mature into a broader idea. Afterwards, we work on specific points of entry into real-world conditions. To do this, I incubate the initiative in my office as a proposition for a business, academic, or policy design startup. Once we devise a structured proposal, we look to private and public institutions for sponsorship to develop a company. At this stage, we, that is the designers and researchers, work together with this new company to develop and deliver a proof of concept that may allow for a second stage of growth and to replicate and distribute it as a system. And then, well, I still have to wait and see what happens. This is uncharted territory for me still. I do hope that Urban Studios will become part of a larger structure sponsored by a serious institution that could grant better access to human and intellectual capital and further the options for implementation of our projects. I will now speak a little bit about the kind of investigations that interest us at Urban Studios, and I will show just a couple of projects, and finally I will introduce our first initiative that is already in the process of incubation as a company and has gathered sponsorships from both public and private sectors. So first, design diversity as irreplaceable knowledge, the geocultural and the geographical. So the knowledge base of empiric experience should no longer be allowed to waste, mostly because of ignorance, petulance, prejudice, and much knowledge of traditional systems has been lost in the processes of globalization, by Europeans first, and America afterwards. Just like in the Middle Ages, that forgot the knowledge of the ancient world, we discredit and lose empirical traditional wisdom when we cannot explain it. But this is a twofold problem. Many, many times, the self-images that cultures constructed about themselves are no longer viable within the larger concerns of sustainability and planetary limits. The geographic capabilities of the territory they occupy may not be in sync with their virtual or metaphysical self-image. For example, we are the people of maize. We're culturally an agricultural society. Yet, our land lacks the water resources to sustain this idea. Or another example, the myth in the developed industrialized nations of the progress era, a notion of modernity that no longer can be, yet certain politicians keep making the promise to bring it back. So could we construct expanded notions of our collectives that may allow to introduce geography and planetary limits? Could the design of cities and territory provide such visions? This could be part of the ethics of place that Mikel mentioned. So the second one is poetic massive inhabitation. Already 120 million inhabitant metropolitan region exists in the Pearl Delta River. Tijuana, where I'm working now, it's already 1,300 square kilometers. 1,300 square kilometers. I mean, just for comparison, Mexico City political proper demarcation is 1,500. And its metropolitan region is already 4,000 square kilometers, while the Zona Metropolitana del Valle de México is 18 square kilometers. 8,000, I mean. Even if only Tijuana has 2 million population and we house around 20 million. So should we fail to find ways to create conditions of poetic, beautiful, sustainable inhabitation and meaningful, at this scale, most of humanity will be destined to inhabit cities like the ones we already know are happening in India or here in the Zona Metropolitana del Valle de México, for example. A third thing we're exploring is post-war mobility. After finding this intriguing picture years ago, I realized I had no knowledge of any animal that throughout evolution had come up with a wheel as a means for mobility. Engineering, in all its might, considers the wheel too perfect for nature to come up with the idea. This is actually something I read. I believe this to be incredibly petulant and short-sighted. The historical cost of subsidizing the wheel as the idea we base our mobility on is gargantuan. Almost any idea would become great if we throw this amount of resources in it. Regardless of this effort, many of our cities today feel less and less progressive or advanced from a human accessibility perspective. The advancement of other sources of mobility intrigue us because of what they imply for the way we conceive and design our cities and territory. It is actually widely assumed that the grid is what structures the very notion of our cities. So what cities could we create if the grid is no longer required or desirable from a mobility perspective? 4, multifunctional infrastructure, built environments of complementary performance. Most of our technology today is assumed as multifunctional, and to a certain degree, our architecture in cities is expected to be mixed use. But contrary to this process of integration and complexity, most of our infrastructure today is far from multipurpose. Roads are only roads, treatment plants only clean water and are non-sociable, agricultural land is used just for food production, just like trains for passengers are not for cargo or vice versa. We are looking in this work to demand more from infrastructure, by introducing a notion of complementary performance, integrating it with architecture and landscape, just like it happens in this image. I first attempted this in an academic 4-day workshop by invitation of IBA a few years ago in Heidelberg. We devised an amplified idea of bridge and rail yards as park and architectural space to introduce a new student charter and connect two sides of the city in the river. It worked in capturing the imagination of the city, and our proposal was the only one that actually made it to the papers after a public presentation of the project. And just in case you're wondering, this was 2014, so before Heather Wick's Park Bridge London thing, and actually it made sense in Heidelberg. We're now talking to cities about this idea of amplified bridges as parks to introduce green space and services into densified neighborhoods that lack the open space to do so. Main arteries can now be transformed into public space intended for human, not just space for cars. We also tested this polyfunctional approach in Atlacomulco in the state of Mexico. We were asked to design a public multi-sport facility, but we convinced the government that we could do it as an ecological park in such a way that it may double as a treatment plant by introducing water bodies and phytoremediation. So, fifth, unplugged cities, distributed wire and tubeless sanitary infrastructure, closed-cycle buildings and infrastructure. I was very surprised to learn that there were only 4 million telephone landlines in Nigeria before cellulars, and that in only 10 years, that number jumped to 40 million with wireless technology. What that access to banking, information, communication, etc., implied to life quality improvement is incredible. I also learned that people like Bill Gates are working to redesign the toilet to reduce worldwide child mortality. Because basic infrastructure features are not available to most human beings around the planet, sanitation is still the largest cause of death in infants. I believe that we have failed to reach most people because the design of the system is not logical and counterintuitive even, and this needs to be reconsidered. See, our biology is designed in such a way that after we extract energy from our aliment, we have an 8-meter pump installed that extracts all liquid from it, making it possible to mix it with soil and even enrich it while doing it. So why our technology does exactly the opposite? Why after all that process to dry our waste, we throw it back into clean water? It is really an old paradigm from a time with lack of planetary limits, and it is no longer in the best foreseeable future. I believe we need to unplug our cities, generate closed-cycle architecture and complementary performance infrastructure in them. And in this scenario, third world that lacks infrastructure is in a very special position. Cities may skip altogether the modern concept of infrastructure, just like Nigeria skipped the telephone lines by going directly to cellular. I am very intrigued about what our cities can become, how would they perform, how would they look if we actually do this. 6, territorial destruction, rural regulation, and planning, the invisible city. Since we started looking at infrastructure that sustain our cities, we began to look at output, but also at input. How do we feed these gigantic numbers of people covered by water? 97% of this is salt water. 2 is indeed sweet, but it's not available because it's frozen or buried too deep, and only 1% is accessible for human use. In most of Mexico, we are reaching doomsday scenarios of water scarcity, for example. Yet, agriculture in Mexico and worldwide uses and contaminates 70% of the water we consume in such a manner that 60% of it is lost to leaks, inefficient irrigation, and thirsty crop not suitable for the pace of production. For example, in Mexico, we actually export virtual water to the USA. When we buy maize from them and we export tomatoes and avocado, we're actually exporting water. So, agriculture impacts the planet brutally and is also a main source of nitrogen pollution of water bodies. This sounds kind of abstract, but when you look at it from a close range, it's actually quite terrifying. Fertilizers are killing our oceans, rivers, and lakes. So that takes us to food security. A big part of this problem is that agriculture has evolved little in at least 3,000 years. It has become way more sophisticated, but its basic logic is still that of a monofunctional infrastructure supported by a highly intensive abuse of land and water, which are both non-renewable resources. Even rain crops pollute with nitrogen due to the fertilizers. So by 2050, worldwide population will peak to a maximum of 10 billion people. This is actually not an escapable scenario. There is no way to reverse this anymore. Only after the year 2100, population worldwide may begin to decrease. We will require an increase by 70% of our current capacity to produce, procure, and distribute food worldwide to avoid hunger of billions. But already, in a world with 7 billion, we face incredible challenges and contradictions. Increasing worldwide population by 40% seems not possible to sustain. Looking at this present makes us believe that overpopulation is actually the problem, and that unless we stop growing by any means necessary, and I've heard the craziest things when people talk about that, hunger will strike, wars will devastate the world, and sort of a Middle Ages will come to be again. Because of those who believe blindly in our technological accomplishments and progress, one may simplify the problem to we are just too many. Within this scenario, global food security seems like an impossible task, but this is absolutely myopic. Our technology is a problem. Our ways of doing things, this is what needs to change. Those, actually, let's stay on this one. Those who believe we do not need a profound transformation and that we may sustain the status quo with technology will probably argue that in this scenario, desalination on a massive scale will become a feasible alternative to keep doing what we do. Let me be clear, desalination is limited, but not by the cost in money, but by the cost in pure energy. Even if we could harvest all the solar energy that the Earth receives, it would not suffice to desalinate the amount of water we would require. I don't have the time to really explain this, so don't trust me, but trust Molly Yan, Dr. Molly Yan, who was actually advisor to President Obama on food security and who has the data to support this. It is actually true that there are huge advancements on water harvesting from raw air, for example. Companies like Ale Water by Marc Parent do this, but it is far from reaching the necessary scale to sustain a 70% increment of the existing capacity of food production. And I would really not bet the future of mankind on the assumption that some groundbreaking technology will come to save us, like 3D printing our food, for example, which is happening, but still, I'm optimistic. This crisis means that we get to improve the way we do things. We are no longer going for the miracle product to lose weight. We actually need to engage healthier lifestyles. So I'm very optimistic even. We're now having a worldwide conversation on these challenges, and most importantly, if we are a little humble and look sharply at our institutions and our infrastructure, we can see that increasing population is not the problem. Our creations to sustain modernity are so full of mistakes, of inefficiencies, of wrong assumptions, petulance, and even plain stupidity, that radical innovation has enormous space and opportunity to flourish. So a few years back, we began to work on this. We did a few academic studios, one by Charles' invitation to the GSD in Harvard, and recently this process has actually gained some traction. We have gathered support from both local and federal governments and from private venture capital funds to establish a project to explore intensive vertical organic production of produce. We are calling it Food Cluster. We plan to build an organic food factory that will run on an operative system that will increase the speed and production of food by even 1,000 times in some cases, and it will save 98% of the water used by conventional methods without using pesticides. We plan to produce food faster with better yields and returns and with better, longer lasting taste. And it will reduce the territory required to such extent that the production within the space of consumption and massive distribution becomes feasible. We want to bring food production back to the city. At this point, I cannot show you images of what we're doing, but I am very excited by the possibility of detonating a technological business that may create a new type of public space within the city, one where production of aliment and culture may come together. I want to finish with an image from our Texcoco strategy because there is a very important discussion that needs to happen more openly. This laser? Okay. One of the one about the enormous potential that the land of the existing airport represents to the future of the Zona Metropolitana del Valle de Mexico. There are 700 hectares of empty space, almost, just 5 kilometers from the Zócalo, and these opportunities are unprecedented importance. after we lost this. This discussion of what should happen, the speed of change, and especially how to preserve emptiness, empty space for future potential, needs to happen beyond private and political agendas. It is a non-renewable urban resource that we cannot afford to waste to petty development, political, or business interests. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's a very interesting, very provocative presentation. And I think basically what you're doing is you're throwing a big challenge to the profession, because it's actually a call to rethink the way we operate, as architects, as landscape architects. I want to link the first question to the beginning of the event, where Charles explains the origin of landscape urbanism. There is there's a number of conditions that allow that new discipline to emerge in the context of North America. There's deindustrialization, there is economic issues, there's a design culture that allow that to happen. And therefore, there is this now more coherent work that is happening in North America, in Europe, in UK. But I'm not so sure about that in Mexico, in the context of Mexico. And the question to you is, how do you see that happening in the context of Mexico City? There's a local context that you explained, that is a completely different context. It's not a depopulation situation. It kind of drives a completely different conditions, but still it seems that the question you posed and the question of landscape are very relevant. So how do you see that happening here? And if you have hopes that this, at some point with the presentations in the previous panel, will become a coherent body of work that maybe you and other people could lead in academia, but also in the practice.
Thank you. Okay. Well, first, I think that's actually happened already. 10 years ago, there was no conversation around this at all. Just looking at the projects presented this morning, it's already very encouraging because, this is something that people were not doing 10 years ago. Very few people were actually engaged. And I think this is extending not only within the design world, but also in the capacity to receive these ideas and to become interested in them from people who are actually going to make them happen. And I mean politicians, but I also mean other decision makers. So in terms of what's happening in Mexico, I think that it is already happening. And when you go to talk to somebody, at least in certain states of the country, about the possibilities that such an approach may bring about, I find an openness that I did not 10 years ago. The first times I talked to people, let's say 10 years ago about this, was really something weird. Stormwater management, for example, the first time I talked about it in Infonavit, they didn't even know what it was. And also the experiences abroad, the things that have happened elsewhere, also help, take away the fear of being the first one to do something. In Mexico, we do have this fear. Instead of going for things, we are really reluctant to be the first one to try them. And I don't even think it's about resources. It's just a state of mind. It happens with soccer. It happens with the city. It happens in many spaces.
When I arrived to Mexico last Monday, I went through the airport, through the corridors, and I was very surprised to see the corridor full of pictures of infrastructure. But what surprised to me was that the infrastructure looked like the 20th century infrastructure. It didn't look to me like the infrastructure, for example, you were describing, or you were kind of aspiring to get to, no? And to me, that was, on the one hand, very kind of portrayed to me a very pessimistic view, no? Because that's almost the official view that you get of Mexico when you arrive. You see pictures of, highway interchange, like all over being built across Mexico, like huge dam, et cetera, no? And that's some sort of officially vision of Mexico that you have when you arrive to the airport. But when I saw the examples of today, that brings back somehow the optimism. But the question is, like, how do you reconcile, that reality of, the political situation that I think you are interested to engage with, like the model that you try to portray is a sort of engagement with private, with the public, but also with politicians, no? But right now, I mean, in Mexico seems to be a kind of complex condition to happen. So how do you see a way forward?
There are many problems in our country, in particular. This relates to lack of accountability and to corruption, basically. Building enormous pieces of infrastructure are cash cows for officials and for many people involved. Right now, for example, it's crazy. I mean, you even find people, for example, from Conagua who are not willing to accept projects that will treat the water, for example, of a new development of housing with phytoremediation. And unless you're willing to pay for the construction of the treatment plant that they already have as well, which is crazy. I mean, I just learned that some super large developers from Chihuahua who are working in Tijuana, they had to, the guy almost lost his job in the company because he actually worked towards it. They created this entire landscape project that will actually be the infrastructure that supported the entire system of this super big development. And just in the last mile, everything was approved, they kept going, the authorities approved everything, and just on the last mile, they told them that it was okay to build the wetlands, but you have to buy the plant. So basically what happened is that he almost lost his job because it meant, like 1 year of work back to the design table, and of course they did not pay for the wetlands and the treatment plant. So as long as these super large projects, which are based on concrete, steel, basically, and big maneuvers that imply a lot of money, are not accountable, I think it's going to be very difficult to create alternatives because the decision makers will be biased towards this kind of infrastructure.
I think we are running out of time. It has to be very short, but something that I wanted to bring to the conversation was the scale issue. No? I was very happy to see also in some of the previous presentation and in your presentation large images of Mexico City, to have a sort of conscious of what we are doing or what is happening as a valley, no? But also, I think some things that you mentioned also prompted to think about, like, well, maybe we should even think bigger, no? Like, it's not enough, let's say, to think about the valley, the zona metropolitana of the Mexico, because, for example, water comes from another valley, no? The Cutzamala or the Lerma system. Also, the drainage system that we throw is actually producing agricultural landscapes in Hidalgo, et cetera, which is something that you are. But some people, I don't know, they don't realize that might be a design problem, no? Like, that might be also an issue or a responsibility of architects or landscape architects, et cetera, no? So, do you see that being something that our profession could engage and see that scale as a design process? Because it's normally seen more as an analysis, no? Like, you analyze your context, but you don't see it as a design process. And then you start kind of implemented one part, no? One street or one ravine or one river, but you don't see the whole thing as a design. How do you see that?
I think that more and more, every aspect of production of whatever, not only architecture, but any other kind of thing, like, I don't know, fashion, is tracking its own shadow, no? And trying to understand better how it is that you can buy a T-shirt, that was made around the globe for $5, and basically it's because there's child labor behind it, no? So, I mean, how do we sustain certain things that we do? We do it because we're doing something else that's that's destroying the basic things that we're supported on. So I do think that we have to not only be aware, but start to discuss this more seriously, and we have to bring alternatives. Now, from individual practices, it's very difficult to engage this entire thing. I mean, you cannot really pretend that a small project is suddenly becoming, because clients are always scared of that as well, and no matter how institutional they are. I mean, very few times when you bring this super large option, people would go for it. When we did Texcoco, for example, we were invited actually just to work on a 300-hectare space, just next to the Lago Nabor Carrillo. And we were invited to do this, but we came on with the project for the 14,000 hectares. And I thought they would call security, but they actually went for it. So it's, I mean, but I think that kind of thing is the exception. Sometimes we're not going to be able to do so, but at least bringing the discussion. I think Pedro made something said something very interesting about bringing the media in and informing more people about these things. I don't believe people to be suicidal. I think that if we have the information that we're doing something that's actually damaging, most people will be willing to revise that and to set up credible alternatives or viable alternatives. So maybe it's about the information.
Or perhaps it's also creating the visions for the future. No, like, I mean, probably larger scale projects, may seem implausible right now, but maybe they also, they can be the science fiction of the architecture. Like, imagine what could happen, and that will be as part of the information that you're saying. No? I mean, Pedro showed this kind of running of the whole valley in 500 years. No. Would be interesting to see what would happen in the next 500 years. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but that is something that just would be, interesting to kind of look at, just to imagine those possible futures.
Definitely, I think that, for example, the loop should be on every bus stop, so people will know and notice, and then start to push for the project. I think that once you actually see it, it's easier for people to actually demand it. Before that, it's kind of difficult to imagine. If you, I don't know, if Ford was, had a focus group and asked people before the car what they wanted, they would probably want a carrot with more horses. Steve Jobs said that people don't know what they need, and I don't think it was petulant. It's because they don't have the information to imagine what's possible. Many times we hear that this cannot happen in Mexico. I think Gabriel was saying that, that greenery cannot happen. So if you actually give the information and prove that it's possible, then I think people get very excited. And I think that moonshots, and that's why I talked about them, have this capacity to make people excited and engaged in larger, far-reaching projects that otherwise seem impossible.
Thank you very much. Pedro is looking at us.
Thank you.